Welcome to the Book Nook podcast, everybody. If you love getting lost in a great book, well, you're in the right place. And speaking of books, there's a link in the description where you can grab a copy of the one we're diving into today.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into a play that's been captivating audiences for centuries. Hamlet, by, of course, the one and only William Shakespeare.
That's right, Hamlet. And we've got some really cool perspectives to help us understand why it's still so popular today. We've got a great review from Brooklyn.v.bookworm, and then transcripts from 2 YouTube videos, one from Better Than Food and the other from Course Hero.
Yeah, some really interesting stuff. Brooklyn.the.bookworm calls Hamlet a compelling tragedy of a tormented young prince of Denmark, which, pretty much sums it up.
Right. Tormented is the word. And get this, Brooklyn.the.bookworm has actually both read the play and seen it performed, and they still consider it one of their favorites.
Wow. That really says something about how powerful this play is. I mean, it can grab you whether you're reading it or seeing it live.
Absolutely. And the host of Better Than Food was reading it for the first time and mentioned that it's Shakespeare's longest tragedy, which makes sense when you think about how deeply it explores Hamlet's character.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, you need a lot of space to really get into all of those layers, right? And Course Hero points out how much Hamlet has influenced our culture, even if people haven't read it. Like, we all know phrases like to be or not to be, even if we don't know where they come from.
It's true. Hamlet is everywhere. Okay, so we've got this young prince, right? And his world is turned upside down by betrayal. Talk about a rough time. Where do we even start with this story?
Well, I think The Ghost is a pretty good place to start. Both Better Than Food and Course Hero talk about how the ghost of Hamlet's father shows up and, well, drops a major bombshell.
Yeah, he basically tells Hamlet that his own brother, Claudius, murdered him. And then Claudius married Hamlet's mother, Gertrude, and took the throne. That's rough.
It really is.
Yeah.
And Brooklyn.the.bookworm and Course Hero both mention that Hamlet vows to avenge his father's death. That vow becomes like the driving force behind everything he does.
Right. But he doesn't exactly rush into action, does he?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, he starts acting all crazy, pretending to be mad.
That's right. Brooklyn.the.bookworm and Better Than Food both talk about that. It's like Hamlet's way of keeping an eye on Claudius and trying to figure out if he's really guilty.
Like, remember that play within a play? It's like Hamlet's trying to get a reaction out of Claudius to see if he'll crack. It's pretty clever.
It is, but also a little bit creepy.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the other characters, because Hamlet is full of these really interesting relationships. What about Ophelia?
Oh, Ophelia. She's just tragic. Brooklyn.the.bookworm really gets into her story. She's totally torn between her love for Hamlet and her loyalty to her family, her father Polonius and her brother Laertes.
It's like she's trapped in this impossible situation. And it ends so tragically for her. She loses her mind and then, well,
It's heartbreaking. And then you have Laertes. Brooklyn.the.bookworm points out how he's like a mirror image of Hamlet in a way. They've both lost their fathers and want revenge.
Right. But they go about it in such different ways. Laertes is all about action, while Hamlet is much more, well, Hamlet. He overthinks everything.
Exactly. It's a great contrast. And then there's Gertrude, Hamlet's mother. Brooklyn.the.bookworm brings up some really interesting questions about her, like how much did she know about the murder? What were her motives? Was she just naive, or was there something more going on?
Yeah, and even the ghost kind of speaks about her in this, like, almost gentle way, which Brooklyn.the.bookworm also points out. And then that whole thing at the end with the poisoned wine. Was she really trying to protect Hamlet? Or was it more complicated than that?
It definitely makes you think, okay, now we got to talk about Claudius, the guy who started this whole mess.
Right. He's such a fascinating character. I mean, he's the villain, but he's not just a simple, evil, bad guy.
No, not at all. Brooklyn.the.bookworm calls him a good old complex antagonist. He's got charm, he can be decisive, but he's also incredibly manipulative.
And Better Than Food even points out that he seems to feel some remorse for killing his brother. But then he's perfectly happy to benefit from it. It's like he's constantly wrestling with himself.
Yeah, totally. And as the play goes on, Hamlet gets sent away to England, but then he ends up back in Denmark.
And that leads to that incredibly powerful scene with the gravedigger and Yorick's skull. Oh man, that scene always gets to me.
Oh, it's so good. Like Better Than Food and Course Hero both talk about how it really makes you think about death and what it all means.
Right. The gravedigger is so casual about it, while Hamlet is just completely floored when he realizes whose skull he's holding. It's like this really dark humor, but also incredibly moving. And then in Hamlet's line, Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio. Just wow.
Yeah, it's just one of those lines that stays with you. And then, well, it all builds to that final tragic showdown.
Oh, the fencing match. It's a mess.
So Course Hero explains how Claudius and Laertes come up with this plan to kill Hamlet using a poisoned sword and poisoned wine.
And of course, it all goes horribly wrong. Gertrude drinks the poisoned wine that was meant for Hamlet.
And then Laertes, he confesses everything as he's dying. He tells Hamlet that they were both poisoned, that it was all a setup.
It's just devastating. Gertrude dies, Laertes dies, Hamlet kills Claudius, and then Hamlet dies too. So much loss.
Okay, so we've talked about the plot. Now let's get into some of the bigger themes that make Hamlet so much more than just a revenge story.
Revenge is definitely huge, though. Both the bookworm and Course Hero point that out.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see how different characters approach it. Like Hamlet, he's so conflicted about it.
Right, while Laertes is all about immediate action. And then you have Fortinbras, who shows up at the very end. He's got this whole political angle on revenge. It's like Shakespeare showing us all these different sides of the same coin.
Yeah, and then you have the theme of death. It's everywhere in this play.
Oh, yeah. Better Than Food and Course Hero both talk about that. It's like Hamlet is constantly thinking about death, about what happens after we die, like in that famous to be or not to be speech.
And there are all those images of skulls and graveyards. It's like a constant reminder of how fragile life is.
And then there's the whole madness thing, both real and pretend madness.
Right. Hamlet puts on this act of being crazy, which is partly a way to protect himself, but it also lets him say things he wouldn't normally say. But it also hurts the people around him, like Ophelia.
Her descent into real madness is just so sad. And Course Hero also talks about the theme of truth versus deception. There are so many secrets and lies in this play.
Yeah, everybody's hiding something. It's like you can't trust anyone. And then you have Hamlet himself. He's such a thinker, but he's also really indecisive.
Right. Course Hero really gets into that. It's like he's stuck in his own head, always overthinking things. And that's such a contrast to characters like Laertes and Claudius, who are all about taking action.
And Better Than Food and Course Hero both mention how the father-son relationships in the play might be connected to Shakespeare's own life. He lost his son and his father around the time he was writing Hamlet.
Makes you wonder how much of his own grief and experiences went into the play. Okay, let's talk about some of these unforgettable characters. Hamlet himself is just so complex.
Yeah, he's not your typical hero, is he? Like Better Than Food and Bookworm both talk about how he's insecure, full of doubt, but also capable of such deep thought.
It's that struggle that makes him so relatable, I think. He's not perfect, he's just human.
And then there's Horatio, such a good friend to Hamlet.
The best. Bookworm really highlights his loyalty, especially in those last lines, "Good night, sweet prince." You can just feel the weight of their friendship.
Their bond is like a bright spot in this otherwise really dark story. And we've talked about Laertes, how he and Hamlet are kind of two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, that's Bookworm's observation. They both want revenge, but Laertes acts right away while Hamlet hesitates. And then, oh, Ophelia.
Bookworm calls her a poor doomed darling, which is just perfect. She's so caught between her family and her heart, and it just destroys her in the end.
It's really tragic. And then finally Claudius. We've talked about how complex he is. He's not all bad.
No, Better Than Food and Bookworm both point that out. He can be affectionate, but he's also ruthless.
Yeah.
It's like he's trying to convince himself that what he did was okay.
Yeah, and that makes him a much more interesting villain. So what is it about Hamlet that makes it so timeless? Why are we still talking about this play hundreds of years later?
Well, Course Hero and this idea of the greenish bookshelf, that kind of classic literature feeling, both talk about how Hamlet deals with these universal themes: revenge, death, love, loss, political corruption. Those are things that are always relevant.
Right. Shakespeare just had this incredible ability to tap into the human experience in a way that transcends time. And the greenish bookshelf idea also reminds us that Shakespeare really meant for his plays to be performed, not just read.
It's true. Seeing Hamlet on stage is a whole different experience. The language comes alive.
Better Than Food brings up another interesting point. There are a lot of unanswered questions in Hamlet, like why doesn't Hamlet act sooner? What's really going on with Gertrude? Those ambiguities keep us coming back to the play, trying to figure things out.
And Better Than Food mentions that one of the first recorded performances of Hamlet actually happened on a ship off the coast of Sierra Leone.
That's amazing. I mean, it shows you how this play can reach people all over the world. And then, of course, there are all the famous lines from Hamlet.
Like, to be or not to be, Alas, poor Yorick, something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Even people who haven't read the play know those lines. They're part of our culture.
It's true. They're so powerful and memorable. So, wrapping up our deep dive, it's clear that Hamlet is a masterpiece. The plot is gripping, the characters are so complex, and the themes are universal. It's no wonder it's still so relevant today.
Absolutely. And if you're enjoying these deep dives, we'd love for you to subscribe to the Book Nook podcast and leave us a review. We really appreciate your feedback.
So, as we finish our exploration of Hamlet, here's something to think about. In a world that's still full of injustice and uncertainty, what can we learn from this tormented prince? What does his story tell us about ourselves?
Thanks for listening to the Book Nook podcast. Make sure to subscribe and leave a review. And don't forget to check the link in the description to grab your copy of Hamlet. Happy reading.